The summer heat had settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, pressing down on every roof and every yard. Lawns shimmered with the glow of sprinklers, and families retreated indoors to escape the relentless sun. Yet in one house at the corner of the block, a father had other plans. His children had been restless for weeks, begging for something more than the monotony of air-conditioned rooms and the occasional walk to the park. That Saturday morning, he brought home a brightly colored inflatable pool. It wasn't much, just a small circular pool big enough for two kids to splash around in, but to them, it was magic. They filled it with water from the garden hose, laughing and squealing as the cool water sprayed over them. Their laughter echoed down the street, light and carefree, a rare burst of joy in a neighborhood that often prided itself more on rules than on happiness. The father watched with quiet satisfaction, remembering his own summers as a child when the simplest things, a sprinkler, a bucket of water, or a garden hose, created the happiest of memories. For him, this pool wasn't just about cooling off. It was about giving his kids a piece of the carefree childhood he once had. But not everyone saw it that way. From the second-story window of a house just down the street, another set of eyes watched the scene unfold. The woman behind the glass was known by nearly everyone in the neighborhood, though not for reasons of kindness or warmth. She had lived there longer than most, carried herself with a sense of superiority, and believed it was her personal duty to enforce order. Her name was whispered with frustration whenever she passed. Karen. Karen's yard was immaculate, every hedge trimmed to military precision, every flower bed bursting with carefully curated blooms. She lived for the compliments she imagined others gave when they drove past her perfect home. To her, appearances were everything, and to her, joy, especially noisy, unregulated joy, was nothing more than chaos. The sight of the inflatable pool filled her with irritation. The shrieks of happy children struck her ears like an offense. To her, a pool like that didn't belong in a neighborhood as pristine as this one. She believed rules existed for a reason, and she had memorized every word of the HOA handbook as if it were sacred scripture. That evening, after the sun dipped low and the children went inside, the father found a letter tucked under his front door. It wasn't signed, but its message was clear. It cited the HOA's guidelines, claiming that temporary water structures were unsightly, a violation of neighborhood standards, and subject to fines. The words were sharp, cold, and impersonal. The father knew immediately who had written it. No one else in the neighborhood cared enough to turn something so harmless into a problem. It could only be Karen. At first, he considered simply letting it go. It was just a letter, after all. Maybe ignoring it would make it go away. But over the next few days, he noticed Karen lingering outside more often, glaring at his yard as if her eyes alone could pierce through the pool and drain it dry. She called the HOA directly, escalating her complaint beyond anonymous notes. Soon he received an official notice, stamped with the association's seal, warning him that fines would follow if the pool wasn't removed immediately. For his children, it was heartbreaking. The pool they had loved so much was now off-limits, deflated and folded back into its box. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by silence and disappointment. Karen had won, at least for the moment, but what she didn't realize was that her victory had planted a seed. The father wasn't just annoyed, he was determined. He saw the injustice of it, the absurdity of a grown woman dedicating her time to destroying a child's happiness. And he knew he couldn't let it end there. Karen thought she had silenced the fun. She thought her rules and complaints had put an end to the matter. But she had underestimated the resilience of a father who only wanted to see his kids happy. The inflatable pool was gone, yes. But what would rise in its place would be something Karen and the entire neighborhood would never forget. The pool was gone, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the summer heat itself. The father could see the disappointment in his children's faces every time they looked at the folded plastic tucked away in the corner of the garage. What had once been a symbol of carefree joy had turned into a reminder of defeat, of victory, handed to a neighbor who thrived on control. Yet in that silence, an idea began to grow. It wasn't born out of anger alone, but out of something deeper. The stubborn determination of a parent unwilling to let pettiness define his children's summer. Karen had wanted to strip away joy from his family, to replace laughter with rules and fines. But in doing so, she had done more than spoil a weekend. She had issued a challenge. The father spent nights scrolling through ideas online, searching for alternatives that could give his kids something bigger, better, and, most importantly, something that Karen could never ignore. That's when he found it. An image of a massive slip and slide stretching across a backyard glistening with water and sunlight. It wasn't just fun. It was bold, dramatic, and impossible to hide. The thought made him smile for the first time in days. If Karen wanted to complain about a small inflatable pool, then she hadn't seen anything yet. What he was about to create would make that pool look like nothing more than a puddle. The planning began quietly. Measuring tape stretched across the yard as he calculated every angle and slope. Trips to the hardware store grew frequent, each time with supplies hidden under tarps in the back of his truck. Long rolls of heavy-duty plastic sheeting, gallons of dish soap for maximum slipperiness, sprinklers and hoses, even small inflatable bumpers to keep everything contained. The neighbors began to notice. At first, they were curious, whispering among themselves about what project could possibly require so many late-night preparations. Some shook their heads, assuming it was nothing more than a renovation gone wrong. But a few watched with interest, sensing something unusual, something that might just break the monotony of their carefully controlled community. Karen, of course, noticed more than anyone. From her vantage point behind her lace curtains, she recorded every movement, every delivery, every strange piece of equipment that crossed his driveway. She reported him to the HOA twice before construction even began, claiming he was modifying his property inappropriately. Each time the HOA reached out, but there was little they could do. He wasn't breaking any rules, yet. What she didn't realize was that every complaint, every glare, and every note only fueled his resolve. This wasn't just about fun anymore. It was about principle. Karen had tried to steal joy from his children, and now he was going to give them something so extraordinary that it couldn't be contained by her petty rules. Finally, after weeks of planning, the day came. He unrolled the plastic across his backyard, securing it in place with stakes and padding the edges for safety. The sprinklers were set, the hoses connected, and the dish soap mixed in buckets ready to spread across the surface. From the top of the small slope behind his house, the slip and slide stretched like a glistening ribbon of rebellion, longer than any pool could ever be, wider than any rule book could regulate. As the water began to flow and the sun caught the shimmering surface, his children's eyes widened with wonder. The disappointment of the pool was forgotten in an instant, replaced by excitement so pure it seemed to electrify the air. They launched themselves down the slide, laughter erupting with every splash, echoing even louder than before. The sound carried across the block, louder, wilder, and more joyful than Karen had ever feared. She stormed out of her house, fury etched into every line of her face. But what she saw froze her in place. This wasn't a pool she could call unsightly. This wasn't a violation hidden neatly in the HOA's handbook. This was a spectacle, a celebration, a monument to defiance. The father watched from the sidelines, not just proud of what he had built, but proud of the message it carried. This wasn't just about his kids anymore. It was about every person on that block who had ever felt silenced, every neighbor who had bitten their tongue while Karen played enforcer. And as more neighbors gathered, drawn by the sounds of joy, He knew this was only the beginning. Karen thought she had ended the fun. In reality, she had unleashed something much bigger, something louder, something she could never control. What began as a family victory quickly grew into something much larger. The slip and slide, shimmering under the summer sun, became impossible to ignore. Each day, as the sprinklers hissed and water sprayed across the plastic, laughter rippled through the air. Children from nearby houses started appearing at the edge of the yard, timid at first, peeking through fences and hedges. But soon enough, their hesitation gave way to curiosity and then to boldness. Parents who had been skeptical at first gave in as well. Some brought towels, others snacks, and before long the father's backyard became the heart of the neighborhood. What had started as one man's response to pettiness turned into a summer tradition in the making. The atmosphere was infectious. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now stood side by side, sharing stories and cold drinks while their children soared down the slide. Laughter replaced the stiff silence that had so often blanketed the block, and for the first time in years, the community felt alive. But not everyone was smiling. Karen watched from her window with a fury that deepened with every passing day. What she had dismissed as a foolish project had evolved into a spectacle she could no longer ignore. The sound of children's laughter pierced her carefully guarded sense of order, and the growing crowds of parents and kids represented a direct challenge to her authority. It wasn't just about the slip and slide anymore. To her, this was about control. If the neighborhood could rally behind one man's defiance, then what was the point of her rules? What was the value of her vigilance? Her first move was swift. She called an emergency HOA meeting, citing noise complaints, unauthorized gatherings, and dangerous structures in violation of community safety standards. She painted a picture of chaos, of a neighborhood spiraling into disorder because one man refused to follow the rules, but not everyone on the HOA board shared her urgency. Some had children who had spent their afternoons on the slip and slide, their laughter still echoing in their minds. Others, weary of Karen's constant complaints, quietly wondered if perhaps the father wasn't the problem. Still, Karen was relentless. She demanded inspections, threatened fines, and even began filing daily reports filled with exaggerated claims. Property damage, water waste, public safety hazard. Each accusation more dramatic than the last. Yet, the more she fought, the more the neighborhood seemed to push back. Parents defended the slide, insisting it was safe, supervised, and harmless. Others argued that it brought people together in a way the HOA never had. Slowly but surely, lines were being drawn. By the end of the week, the block had split into two camps. On one side stood Karen, clutching her rulebook and demanding order. On the other stood the father, backed by neighbors, who had rediscovered what it meant to live in a community rather than a collection of isolated houses. The slip and slide became a symbol. For some, it was defiance. For others, it was freedom. And for Karen, it was an enemy that threatened the fragile world of control she had built for herself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the children headed home, the father stood at the edge of his yard, surveying what he had created. It wasn't just water and plastic anymore. It was something far greater, something worth protecting. But he knew Karen wasn't done. Her silence across the street wasn't surrender. It was strategy. He could almost feel her plotting, preparing her next move, and he was right. Because the next day, a letter from the HOA arrived in his mailbox, formal, threatening, and filled with fines. Karen wasn't giving up. She was only getting started. The letter from the HOA was more than just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. Bold black text threatened daily fines, mandatory removal of the slip and slide, and even potential legal action if compliance was not met. At the bottom, Karen's signature glared back like a stamp of personal vengeance. For a moment, the father felt the weight of it all. The joy in his yard, the laughter of the children, the unity that had blossomed. It all now hung in the balance. But then, as he looked out at the giant slip and slide glistening under the sun, he realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had rallied to his side, everyone who had stood up against the suffocating grip of one person's control. Word of the HOA's letter spread quickly through the neighborhood. Parents whispered about fines. Teenagers scoffed at the absurdity, and even elderly neighbors shook their heads at the pettiness. A meeting was called, not by Karen this time, but by the very families who had once been passive attendees. They gathered in the father's backyard, surrounded by the slip and slide that had started it all. As the meeting began, frustration poured out. Parents spoke of the joy the slide brought, of the way it had given their children a summer to remember. Others mentioned how the HOA had become less about protecting the neighborhood and more about enforcing one woman's will. For once, the voices of the community drowned out Karen's shrill objections. But Karen didn't go quietly. She arrived at the gathering with a binder full of citations, storming through the crowd with a confidence that was quickly unraveling. She recited rule after rule, pointing out violations that no one cared to acknowledge. Each word, meant to intimidate, only fueled the collective resistance. Then, something remarkable happened. A motion was raised, not just to dismiss the fines, but to review Karen's place on the HOA board altogether. The neighborhood had grown weary of her constant surveillance, her endless complaints, and her refusal to let others live freely. The slip and slide had been the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for years. The vote was swift and decisive. For the first time in her long reign of control, Karen found herself on the losing side. The majority stood united, their decision clear. Karen would no longer dictate the life of the community. The shock on her face was unmistakable. The binder slipped from her hands, papers scattering like fallen leaves. Her arguments collapsed under the weight of collective will. She stormed off, defeated, retreating into the shadows of the very house she had once used as her watchtower. From that day on, the neighborhood changed. The HOA, once a tool of pettiness, shifted into something more balanced, fair, and considerate. Rules remained, but they no longer stifled joy. Instead, they protected it, and the slip and slide, it stayed. Not just for that summer, but for many summers after. It became a tradition, a symbol of unity, and a reminder that sometimes the simplest things, like water, laughter, and community, are worth fighting for. For the father, it wasn't about winning against Karen. It was about proving that joy couldn't be legislated away, that one person's bitterness couldn't drown out the happiness of many. As he watched his children race down the slide once more, their laughter echoing through the block, he knew he had built more than just a summer playground. He had built a legacy, and across the street, behind curtains drawn tight, Karen was left. With the sound she despised most, the unrelenting, unstoppable chorus of joy.